All right, hello. So welcome to our June book club discussion. So this month we're talking about Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford. It is a weird little book, um, to say the least. So let me know if you're watching on the replay. Let me know your thoughts. I have a lot of questions about this book. Um, so while we're sort of waiting for people to pop in, I do want to give a little disclaimer. So YouTube isn't going to like this stream. So the content warnings for this book are child abuse, incest, and miscarriage. Those are the things that weigh on this book. And because those topics are so present in this story, I do have them worked into the discussion for this evening. So if that is not something you are prepared to handle, I just wanted to give you that heads up so you can choose to come back to this video later or not at all. Also, this book is very much about what a woman will do for good sex. And I have tried in my notes to clean this up where I can to be the most YouTube friendly, but I guess depending on where you're listening to this may be like a headphones in sort of thing. So the plan for this evening is that I'm going to start with some general reactions, some feelings about the story and the experience with the book, more a spoiler-free area, and then I think pretty quickly we're going to have to get into spoilers because this book is so small, but also like so much of what is interesting about this book requires the spoilers. So, quick plot summary. Follow Me to Ground is the 2018 debut novel by Irish fiction and arts writer Sue Rainsford, who's based in Dublin. And I wanted to bring up the Irishness of this author because I found this book to be somewhat settingless. Like it felt really hard to pinpoint a place or a time other than like people are doing labor on farms and there was a war at some point, but now it's peacetime. And women are largely wearing dresses, but working women. So women are not in the domestic space, but I mean, women always worked on farms. So like, do you know what I mean? Like, as you think about the details that were given, like, how do we place it? It's difficult to give it for certain a place to belong in time. And I want to really highlight the Irishness of the author because apparently the audiobook version for this, if anybody listened to this, let me know if this is true for all of the recordings or if there's only one recording. Apparently, whoever narrated the audiobook gave the characters American accents, like Southern American accents, to, I guess, indicate the countryness or like the status of the people, which I feel like would definitely shape your relationship to the text and the setting. So if you are an audiobook listener, what did you think of the audiobook? Let me know either in the chat here or if you're watching this on the replay in the comments later. So this is the story of Ada, who is a non-aging human-like magical creature who lives on the outskirts of a human community. And she and her father live this really quiet life, healing humans with their abilities, and they have the other way to say it is magical. They have the magical ability to reach into human bodies and take out sick organs or to pluck sickness from a body. And if the bodies require larger healings, they can put the bodies into these this burial pit that they have tamed, and the ground, it's a special ground, capital G ground in the book, and the ground works big magic on the bodies, and people emerge from this alive. Ada is older than she appears, like She spent decades on the cusp of adulthood, but throughout the novel, it becomes clear that Ada is definitely not what we would consider a legal consenting adult by human standards. And Ada sort of becomes discontent with her very quiet life of serving the humans, healing the humans, once she starts having sex with an adult human man named Samson. And that puts a rift between her father and her, and this quiet life that they've established, and a messiness ensues. And so I guess my first question for folks is, what were you expecting? Like, was this novel at all what you were expecting based on the title, based on the cover? I feel like the covers either have this lady with the flower hat, like the midsummer flower hat, or I've seen one with, I think, black, like a black sort of matte cover and like roots coming down, maybe lightning bolts, some sort of like earthy interconnectedness thing is happening on the cover. So if you have any initial reactions to this, I would love to know. I feel like the less you know about this, the better. Like I had heard from various sort of reviews that I looked into that it was best to go into this not really knowing much. And I feel like that did make for a fun reading, like an interesting reading. Hey, Lydia. It was totally different. Like, based on the cover and like that dissected lady with her hands over the eyes, and knowing that it was sort of about a young woman and her like sexual awakening, I don't think I was expecting what we got, if that is fair to say. Like, this book is almost horrific in just how bodily it is. Like, you can feel, and like the bodily fluids that like leak and are expelled from humans, it feels very tactile. And the rings of fat on the one older patient, how they move, I guess, when the patient is turned, like it's very like physical in a way that I wasn't really expecting from like Flower Crown. And every time I thought I knew where it was going, I turned out to be wrong. Like I get to a certain point, I'm like, okay, I think I can predict what's happening next. And then I was wrong. So, I mean, it was fun in that way. And I think the first reading of it was just a like roller coaster along for the ride. The second time I read it, I think I was a little bit more critical about the logic of some things. Some of it I started to like actually poke holes in and like follow for continuity. And I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So either Ada is the most unreliable narrator ever, or she's telling sort of untruths that are like half true. Like, I don't know what to believe anymore. So something that I didn't notice the first time, just because you're following the spectacle, was that Ada tells us that father and her don't eat on page 9. And then we see father sipping coffee several times throughout the book. And it's mentioned a couple of times that he's cooking, unclear what. And then I think Ada sits down for tea with one of the cures. I think maybe Lorraine. Lorraine is the one who like wants to hang around. I think they have tea. And then father goes hunting and comes back smeared with blood. So because he's a shapeshifter and he hunts, if he's coming back covered in blood, that implies to me at least that he is in his animal form eating. So like it's one of those things where there's just a little slip up, and a couple of times this is the one that really stands out. But on the reread, I was like, wait a minute, I don't think that's true. I think Ada told us something different. So I guess overall, how do I want to say this? The reread for like themes is more interesting. I think the reread for like the magic and the logic of the story starts to get a little bit holy. So yeah, I hope that folks enjoyed it. Different is a good way to describe it. It's definitely something different. I found a quote by a reviewer who described it as odd and muscular enough to resist an easy interpretation. And I like that description, odd and muscular, because that really nails it, right? So I think something that we can talk about without spoilers is folklore. So I'm curious if folks saw any folklore elements in the story. I have a couple, but I'm sure I've missed some. And there's folklore on many levels. Like there's the local folklore in the text that doesn't involve Ada and her father. So we have the, I guess, legend of Sister Eel Lake. And it's this location that all the locals fear because apparently, according to local legend, at one time it was full of cannibal serpents that these eels were bred to be giant and flesh eating to kill any enemy soldiers who would find this beautiful lake and then like try and bathe in it. And then I guess when the legend goes that when there was peacetime and there were no soldiers to eat, the eels started eating each other until there were just two left, brother and sister eel. And sister eel was able to, I guess, outwit, outlast, outplay. And brother eel falls asleep and she eats him. And there's a child that falls in the lake at some point named Christopher. And they do say that he was eaten. Most of Christopher Plume was eaten, and father worked on him a great deal out of courtesy to the family. So there's some truth to the fact that there's something in the lake that eats people. So you have that local folklore that doesn't involve the guys that came out of the ground. And then building on that folklore is Tabitha Sharp. So Ada finds a miscarried baby at Eel Lake. So it's already this weird place in local lore. And Ada happens to be hanging out there, and there's this like wet popping sound in the air, and then surprise, baby. And so Ada takes this baby home, and there's a woman who is bleeding in a rocking chair, and they're like, obviously, these two belong together. Like, she had a baby and now she doesn't, and I have a baby that is premature. And so they sort of put those together, and Tabitha Sharp becomes this figure in local folklore as well, a little bit tainted by her connections to Ada and to the Sister Eel Lake. And there's mention that they find it, I guess, more believable that Ada had maybe killed the Sharp baby and given her parents a changeling, a strange little creature like myself who would someday do my bidding. Ada tells us that on page 20. So they're like, oh, we have some folklore, and this is how we're going to make sense of it. Because the fact that a baby would just like poof appear at this lake makes no sense. So there's magic in this place. There's unexplained things that they're using other folklore to explain. And then, of course, we actually have changeling folklore throughout a lot of Europe. The idea of a fairy, a human baby stolen by fairies and a fairy left in its place sort of deal for various reasons depending on the area. And folks describe Tabitha as never quite right, so that she's a little bit otherworldly, We learn from Tabitha herself that she sees all liquids red. So her life is like always sort of splattered with blood. And her father fears her and says that maybe we weren't meant to have her on page 69. I think we're also maybe looking at the folklore, the fairy stories around witches and fairies. So Father and Ada do actual magic, right? Like they bury people alive and they remove vital organs and preserve life and remove sickness and locate it, relocate it, I guess, outside of the body. We watch them like pull a sword from Samson's mouth and it manifests on the wall. Sickness never just disappears. They make it outside of the human body. It has to go somewhere. And one of the cures describes Ada as our resident fairy, magicking everyone's sickness away on page 83. And I think similar to, I guess the witch hunts would be most like similar, is that the cures are not loyal. The father is very wary of the humans. And he says that if they give them any cause to frighten, they'll forget how much they need us. Like that, overnight, they'll want us gone on page 62. And then later, there's like a big mess up. And Ada asks her father to help fix this. And he's like, no, I can't. Like, this is too much. It's beyond my abilities. Besides, even if I could fix her, if she remembered any of this, they would burn us. They would burn us down. And that was on 164 to 165. So I feel like that idea of like the witch hunts, of the people doing more like earthy, natural magic, bordering on magical or wishful thinking, that history is sort of baked in here as well. And I'm curious if the folklore helped guide your reading at all, or if it confused your reading. Because I feel like in some ways for myself, the times where I thought I could predict what was happening next was based on like my knowledge of folk and fairy stories and like patterns in literature, patterns in fantasy, patterns in horror. And every time I was wrong. I don't know if anyone found that like the folklore is like it's steeped in folklore, but in some ways it sometimes subverts those expectations, and then it means that I was wrong. And it's kind of delightful to not be able to predict everything. And I guess if we want to build on that, the unpredictability of things, or maybe the predictability of things, I think we can't not talk about the role of women in this text. And I would love to know what folks think, because I feel like it's such a mixed bag. There are quite a few women, especially in the interview point of views with the cures. So there are, I think, 17 throughout the book, and quite a few of them are women. And throughout the book, we see two pregnant people. So we have Miss Sharp and Olivia. We have Lorraine, who is seeking help with menopause. Then there are two married women who married rich to avoid working in the fields. So Lorraine and Olivia. And that work is described as clipped wing work by the other women. So we have quite a variety of women at various points in their lives. And again, of course, there's Ada, right, who is not human, but grows herself the genitals that she desires to participate in sex with people with penises. So we would group her into this group. I think she identifies as a woman. She refers to herself as a she throughout. now I'm thinking about how weird gender is, and like when it's applied to a non-human magical creature that is shifting their body to work in to like human relationships, how weird that is. We're gonna lump Ada in with the women. So we have Ada, who's like pubescent, I would say. We see her attempt to couple and to have relationships with men. We have two women who are about to become mothers. We have married women. We have I totally lost my train of thought. A woman in menopause, right? So we're sort of at the whole spectrum of the experience, the life experience. And I think I'm interested in the the description of some women as doing clipped wing work. So the women who describe domestic workers, women who make home, who are wives and raise families and keep house, their clipped wing, which somehow describes them as less free, right? If you think about a bird that has had its wings clipped so that it can't fly, it's a removal of agency. But the women who are working the fields are still fulfilling that role. They just also work. They are the sort of mythical woman who has it all. They do the paid labor of working in the fields, and they do the unpaid labor of having the babies, making the home. Right? Like it's all still there. So I'm curious about that logic in who is free, whose wings have been clipped, when both groups are still very much stuck in a very like domestic role still. And then also that Ada does women's work. It's all work that is stereotypically associated with women, right? She washes clothing and linens used in the curing. She cares for sick people. There's nothing that specifically genders that work. It's just historically that has been women's work. And so it's almost interesting that her father and his father before her have engaged in this line of work. And Ada is the first woman in like a line of men to participate in this work. I don't know. We'll talk more about the role of women as it sort of comes up amongst the other topics. But if anyone has thoughts on Ada and her work and the role that she does, let me know. I would love to hear. I think the other thing that we can talk about without spoilers is the idea of sickness. And how they're healing, because I find that fascinating. So Ada sings healing, and there's something a little bit sketchy there. It almost sounds like she is stealing from the birds. Like she's always sort of poking her nose in nature, and at a certain point she says something along the lines of like, by this age birds learned to fear me, and or like birds learned that I was dangerous. And I was like, what are you doing to the birds? Like it would have just like throwaways like that. But her father also sings, and he doesn't appear to damage birds. So I don't really know what Ada's up to. But the idea that they can sing the cure's belly open, they sing the sickness away, it trickles into a little bowl under the table, they close the woman up again, and then they pour the sickness down the drain. And this was one of those moments where on the reread I was like, but what does that mean? What does that do? you can't just put things down the drain and like they don't just disappear. Like I feel like we've learned this. Like you can't just throw your waste in the river or build your latrine near a well. Like that's not how it works for keeping healthy. Especially because the father repeats this idea over and over again that sickness doesn't disappear. They don't disappear it from the world. It goes elsewhere. And we have that very early on, like physically pinned for us. Ada, like I've mentioned, cures the sickness in Samson's throat, and the sore appears on the wall like a spot in the paint. And because sick is sick, it's dangerous when it's taken out of the body if it's not dealt with properly. But then they put it down the drain. I mean, sometimes they bury it in the yard. Ada at one point like throws sickness, I think a blood clot from one of the patients. She throws the blood clot into the ground and the ground gobbles it up. And she's like, I know that wasn't the right thing to do. I didn't dispose of it properly. But I did it. That's how I chose to get rid of it. So I have so many questions that we can never answer because I feel like, yes. So Lydia has mentioned that some of those throwaways and random things were partially described that made this book like, what is going on? Yes. Like, and I feel like that was part of the initial, like the first read. I was just like, oh my gosh, like this book is just so wacky. Like you're just sort of on this ride, you're following along. They're like, oh yeah, they throw blood clots on the lawn and the lawn eats it. But then when I reread it, I started like trying to build the logic of this world, and it falls apart a little bit. Or maybe it's not meant to be logical, it's meant to be more whimsical, but I don't know. There are some pretty clear set rules that then Ada doesn't follow. Perhaps that's why everything goes to shit. They also establish very early on that they cannot heal mental illness, that they only remove physical sickness from the body. This is another one of those inconsistencies. So they won't put somebody with mental illness in the ground to treat it because sickness has to go somewhere and you don't just want to release madness or perversion into the world. But then they have a patient who has a mental illness that has physically manifested in his body, and they work to treat the physical illness, not touching the mental illness, just to sort of alleviate his pain with the time he has left. They treat the physical sickness, and then they put him in the ground. And I don't understand why then the ground doesn't work on the sickness that exists in the cure's body. Like, how does the ground know to only touch mental illness, or to not touch mental illness and only touch the physical illness? Is it the difference between the burial patch and the ground? Because that was another thing that the book sort of switched interchangeably between the language. So during the book, I don't know, just in case folks have read the audio. Okay. So they capitalized the ground, putting to capital G ground and the burial patch. So for me, I started to wonder if there was maybe a distinction between the ground and the burial patch, if the burial patch was the place that the father and grandfather had worked to tame, and everything around it was the magical ground that was dangerous. I don't know. Because if if they're putting, if like, and this matters later when, for spoilers, somebody is put to ground in the ground, they are pushed in the ground, not the burial patch. And that the person that comes out of the ground might come out changed and unnatural compared to the cures that are put in the burial patch. And I don't know if we were supposed to make that distinction. It wasn't super clear, but that's the only explanation that maybe I can find for some of these inconsistencies, is that their patch of ground knows only to touch the physical illness. The wild ground, the untamed ground, will do whatever it wants, will create chaos. Okay, we're going to move into light spoilers because we have to talk about Samson and Olivia, who I feel like are maybe more interesting than Ada. Ada is our main character. She's telling us the story. She's sort of this spectacle. But I think Samson and Olivia, it's the are they, aren't they of it all that I found very compelling. And I kept reading certain things throughout this section, and I was like, oh no, my mind's in the gutter. Like, that cannot be what is being implied. I'm giving this the most uncharitable reading, and I was not. But it takes almost until the very end for that to be confirmed and for Ada to realize it. And so I wanted to sort of walk through their relationship as we're given it in the book. And so Samson and Olivia are brother and sister. They grew up in a small room in their aunt's house in poverty. We learn that Olivia met a man named Harry who was older than her and whose house was so big, I don't think she knew what to do with all the different rooms. And it is believed that she got married to avoid working. So she found a wealthy guy and was like, I'm not going to work a day in my life. I will keep house and make babies. But before they get to do that, Harry dies. He dies young, and I thought it was a little suspicious. It isn't clear if he had something like medically wrong with him in a town full of people who have the magical ability to cure him, or if there was some foul play there. I feel like we are left the space, like so many things in this book, we are left the space to believe it possible that Olivia murdered her husband. The thing that sort of backfires on her is that her in-laws then kick her out, and she ends up living with Samson again, and they're back in the same house that they were as kids. Quote, we're sharing a bed like we were when we were children, on page 26, which is weird for adults to do, adult siblings. No? I don't know. Maybe it shouldn't be weird for adult siblings to do because social rules. I don't know. I guess it depends on how temporary an arrangement it is. Olivia's in the chat here. That was most intriguing. Their storyline was most intriguing. The worst part, though, is when I first read this last year. Oh, you forgot about that whole storyline. Interesting. Because I feel like this is the thing that I was so preoccupied on the first read of being like, well, that's a funny way to phrase that. And then being like, oh no, I'm a pervert. Like, don't go there. Why is your mind going there? So it's interesting that it was a forgettable storyline. Because like, I feel like for an adult to be like, we're sharing a bed, I feel like there are certain phrases that are like maybe hinting that they're having sex with each other. And then I was like, oh no, like people share beds in tight spaces when you need to because you can't afford a larger space. Their house is described as small. It's natural to share a bed. And then they have a comparison to the folklore figure of brother and sister eel. So as kids, they would play brother and sister eel, who are these folk figures that are in a toxic relationship. Each one wants to eat the other to survive. And then in the end, the sister does eat her brother. Yeah, I would love to know what tops this. If you've read a lot of weird things, Lydia has mentioned in the chat that they've read too many weird things in the past 2 years. If there's anything comparable to this, let us know, because I feel like if you liked this, the weirdness is a big part of the vibes of this book, and further reading would be fun. We learn that Olivia doesn't get afraid even as a kid. She was never really a kid. She had to grow up really fast. And Samson actually describes Olivia as the opposite of Ada. So Ada is sort of this always child. Olivia is a never child. She had to become a tiny adult really quick when they were orphaned. And again, I think we're sort of hinting perhaps at some history of abuse. Like if you say that Olivia had to grow up really fast, she was never really a child, and her first thing to do when she becomes of marriageable age is to find an old guy so that she never has to work. She could just be married and like untouchable in a relationship, have like a set role in a neat little box. Like it seems like she's very much looking for some stability, maybe, if we want to give Olivia a more charitable reading. And that's the other thing that like I kept going back and forth with too. Like Ada really hates Olivia, and Ada is our narrator, so it's difficult not to hate Olivia. But I feel like if you really look at what we've been given, we might want to have some sympathy for Olivia and the life that she's lived. Same with Samson. Samson tells Ada about his sister being pregnant on page 42 to 43, and it's heavily implied that Olivia is not having her recently deceased husband's baby. Samson goes, "You can do the math as well as me." And we don't know when Samson died, but I mean, you can read that either way, like either in good faith, like, oh yeah, obviously, like Samson only died 3 months ago and she's 8 months pregnant, like obviously, or Samson died 8 months ago, she's 8 months pregnant, the math works, right? Like we're not given that information, so you have this like little ambiguous moment, and we have lots of these with Samson and Olivia's relationship, where you're like, but but what does that mean? And we learn that Olivia is 3 years older than Samson, and Samson says, "I let too much slide when we were young. I kept thinking things would be different once I got to be a man." And we can put a lot in between those lines depending on how you're reading that. Like maybe Olivia leans quite heavily on Samson emotionally, and she's a burden. Maybe Olivia leans financially on Samson. They're close enough in age that Samson could have been working and financially supporting Olivia before she married wealthy. It could be that they were, isolated. They were kept in a room together as kids with an adult that didn't particularly know what to do with them, know how to parent. Did Olivia start sexually experimenting with her 10-year-old brother when she was 13? Which is, again, one of those moments where I was like, that can't be what they mean. But definitely the reading is there. I mean, it's the reading of that, like, I let too much slide when we were young. Like, okay, like, I was young and stupid, and like I didn't quite grasp what we were doing was wrong. I let too much slide when we were young. I kept thinking things would be different once I got to be a man. So, like, once Olivia is married, once he has his own house, his own wife, his own life, he wouldn't have that sexual relationship with his sister again. But I mean, now that she's widowed, they're back in the same house, they're back in the same room, they're back in the same bed. And she's maybe carrying his child. And so Olivia again sort of builds on this, and she asks, what happens when you have a baby with someone you're not supposed to? And Ada tells her, don't fret, Miss Claudette, I've never seen adultery get into a baby. And Olivia goes, is there anything that can get in? And Ada is totally oblivious to all of this, like very naive, very almost childlike. And she's like, you mean like shock? And Olivia's like, no, I mean like other things you're not supposed to do. Like, again, we could be charitable. Maybe Olivia is a heavy drinker or drug user, and she's like, well, you're not supposed to do that. Can that get into a baby? Yes. Or is it the incest baby? Is incest something that can get into a baby? And I almost wonder to what degree Ada is like willfully not seeing. Like, if much like myself as a reader, where I was like, no, Ada's also doing that. Like, she's like, huh, like, what could you possibly be implying? You can't be implying that. Nobody does that. And it, like, to me, it makes her read as really young, really inexperienced, really sheltered. Like, it seems like she's probably learned that cures do not procreate with family members. Like, that is a social taboo, that blood relations, especially close blood relations, don't do that. It's not a good idea. And so it doesn't cross her mind that that is a thing that they could be doing and maybe are doing. Then Olivia says that Samson is sick. He's not right. It can't be fixed. She is worried that if she has a girl baby, that she can't leave it alone with Samson. And I think it's supposed to... I think Ada reads it. This is the better way to say this. Ada reads this as Olivia performing, Olivia deliberately lying. She says that cures have a scent when they lie, and she can smell that Ada is lying. So I think she thinks that Olivia is trying to pull the wool over her eyes, because Olivia knows that Ada and Samson have a sexual relationship, and Olivia doesn't approve. And so Ada thinks that Olivia is making up this lie about her brother being a child predator who will sexually abuse a young girl in her house. And then she sort of like, the line has no punctuation to indicate how we should read this. Again, if anybody read the audiobook, how is this line delivered? Olivia says, us girls must stick together, period. And I found the tone of this line, given the context of it, where Olivia is like looking up at Ada through her lashes, leaving her little rosebud mouth open a little bit, and like her hair is in her eyes, and she seems to be like, oh, like very innocent, right? Like it's a performance. And then she's like, us girls must stick together. no punctuation to indicate if that's like said with a wink, like, haha, you know what I'm implying, or like very serious, like, I'm warning you because I'm about to have a child and I care about child welfare and you look like a child and the world is shitty to women. Us girls have to stick together. And again, it's another one of those moments where I'm like, depending on how you read this, Olivia either looks like an asshat or like somebody trying to warn Ada that her brother is not a good person to mix with. And Ada finds this baffling. She's like, I've never known Akira speak of a sibling or any blood relation in such a way. Of course, there's something different about him. He wasn't afraid of me. And the idea that Samson lacks some sort of natural fear instinct that all of the other humans in Ada's experience seem to find her discomforting. Like they'll tolerate her for a little bit, and then there's something she just does naturally that pushes her out of the realm of human, and she becomes visible as a non-human. And Samson never seems to have that moment. At one point, he even says, Ada, you're not as strange as you think you are, which I read as a genuine statement from Samson, that he's like, you think you're really weird, but like, we're all a little bit fucked up. So the last thing I want to mention here about their relationship is one of the cures quite a bit later. Gilda Flynn is quite blunt, and she says, him and his sister, we used to call them rumor rich. No doubt they're off living in sin somewhere, thinking us all fools. That's on page 147. So not only were we as readers supposed to be getting a hint that like something is not quite right between this brother-sister relationship, the whole town thought that they were a little too close for siblings. And I it's uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. And we'll come back to this, but I wanted to sort of build a body of knowledge, what we know about these two. And then we're going to switch. We're going to talk about the ground, because the ground, again, the ground versus the burial place, we touched on it a little bit. We're told a lot about the ground, that it's this like magical, unusual plot of dirt that non-human creatures like Ada and her father and her grandfather are, I guess baked in would be the best way to describe it. Like they're built and they're put in the ground to percolate, to ferment, to bake or whatever, and then they get removed out of the ground and they are another non-human creature ready to heal. Not quite ready to heal, ready to raise to be a healer. And the father tells us that these patches exist all over the place, that he didn't come from the ground that Ada came from. His father didn't come from the ground that Ada came from. So there's been some like migration over time to a different patch of ground. We know that the ground is difficult to tame. The Ada asks her father why the burial patch takes so long to tame, and the father answers because the ground here is so powerful. So that it's taken, I guess, a couple of generations to prepare a place to do this work. We know that it's sort of a risky thing to engage with because you don't quite know what you're going to get back. The father had several failed attempts at making a child. He's also not quite sure that Ada turned out the way he wanted, which is a curious detail. I think when we get to the end, everything that happens, the idea that Ada didn't go quite to plan, we could maybe talk about that. We'll put a pin in that. Also that the ground has to be maintained. I guess the burial patch has to be maintained. So at one point, the father's like, Ada, we need to redirect some roots. It's going to make it difficult. If they come too close to the house, they're going to crisscross through our patch, and it's going to make it hard to put cures in the ground. And so the idea that they've tamed a small bit, but the rest of the ground is always working to creep in, like it's a constant, never-ending battle against nature and whatever entity the ground is. And it seems that they sort of, I'm assuming that because the ground is magical and the father and Ada both come from the ground, that they sort of derive their powers from the ground, and that their powers sort of exist in this line that gets passed down, and there's a natural waning and waxing of the powers between each one. So they live a really long time, but we know that father's father is buried somewhere on the property, I guess. So he has passed on. So it is possible for them to die. And I guess it's possible for them to perhaps, as they grow further from their time in the ground, become less potent. I wonder, because throughout this novel, we see the father, like the first cure, the father works on it and Ada helps. The father is the one who reaches in, who pulls out the sickly lungs, and he's in control of that curing. Then the next cure we see, I think, is Ada by herself. Like he's like, okay, this is the cure that's coming in, and this is what you need to do. Like this is the plan. I'm not going to be here. And so then we see Ada sort of taking on more and more responsibility. And I would say that Ada isn't particularly good at her job. Now, whether this is because of inexperience, because she's not as powerful as her father, she doesn't care as much as her father. It's interesting, and I'm curious if I'm going to go through a couple of her big mistakes. And I wonder, do you think that the father is losing his power and Ada is gaining power? If we're seeing some sort of natural life cycle, obviously much slower than a human's life cycle, but that Ada, who is not quite an adult, she's like a perpetual child on the cusp of adulthood, is really starting to come into the strength that would be required to maintain the ground, be required to go on healing people. So we see, I think, her first big mistake on page 134 to 136. And so this is where she puts Lorraine to sleep. Lorraine has come in for a cure for her menopause, and she puts Lorraine to sleep, and then she's like, well, lady's asleep. Like, I've already cured her. She's just here because she's sad and lonely, so I'm just going to put her to sleep and, like, dick around. And while she's not in the room, she leaves the cure unattended. Lorraine sort of sleepwalks. She wanders out into the backyard. She pees on the lawn, and then she comes back inside. And Ada's first thought is, if father sees, because she knows she's fucked up. She knows 100% that you are not supposed to leave a cure unattended unless they are buried in the burial patch to have the ground working on them. When they're in the house and you are working a cure, you are there in attendance. And she wandered away. Like she left the cure alone and let her wander away onto the grounds in their backyard, which the father is always warning, like, ooh, the ground's kind of hungry today. It's active today. Like, probably ate an animal overnight, or it just rained and it's soft. Like, stay off of it. Like, a human has potentially wandered into something very dangerous because Ada didn't care to do her job properly. Or the alternative, Ada wasn't powerful enough to put Lorraine to sleep. I don't buy that, though. I buy that Lorraine is like asleep the way she's supposed to be. It's just that Ada didn't attend to her. I'm buying that Ada fucked up. Then her second mistake is on page 38 to 39. We have a little boy named Cormac Kent. And so they're having this conversation, and Cormac's like telling like rude stories about what the kids say about Ada, that like her genitals are on upside down and backwards or something. And she's pissed at him. And all of a sudden he goes from being like talking and being a rude little shit to just being like slumped over. And Ada thinks, I put him to sleep without touching him, without meaning to at all. And she doesn't question this. She's like, I've never done that before. I guess I did it now. And so then she magically cuts him open. She removes his like stomach ulcers, and she flicks his pain into the porch. And then she wakes him up, and he looks fucking terrified. And she's like, oh, he was only stilled. He wasn't asleep. And she hides this from her father too. She sort of like, she sends the kid back to his parents, and she's waiting for the shit to hit the fan. And the kid just doesn't say anything. Like, she gets so lucky that the kid doesn't say anything. And she's like, I'm just gonna hide this mistake. I did a bad job. I didn't check my work. I operated on the patient while he was awake. Won't tell father. And then there's her third mistake. There's a drowned boy that she cannot bring back to life. And so she's emptying the water from his lungs, but she cannot make him live. And the father thinks that she could have. And so we learn that Ada does a bad thing while she's working this cure. She lets her mind wander. She's thinking about Samson, obviously. And because her mind wanders, she isn't able to bring the kid back to life. And everybody finds this weird. The parents of the kid find this weird because she somehow managed to find local folk legend Tabitha Sharp born premature miscarried baby by the lake. The father also talks about how they don't walk over the graves of cures because the dead would sit up in their graves and want to be fixed. So the fact that this boy is just a little bit dead, he's recently dead, you would think that Ada could do it, but he doesn't. But she doesn't, right? As she says that the boy was too far gone. That's what she tells her father. And the father doesn't agree. And I'm curious, and this is what sort of leads me to believe that the father is losing his power as Ada is gaining power. That if the father really thought that the boy could be saved, why didn't he do it? Like, he's there, he's watching Ada do it. Why doesn't he help? Like, we've seen them work together at the beginning of the novel to remove the lungs, and Ada's small hands do like the fine detail work of stitching her back together, stitching that cure back together. Like, we've seen them work together. It's not impossible for them to work together. And the father just watches, which leads me to believe that he no longer can cure. That throughout the passing of time in this novel, Ada is taking the cures on because she is old enough, she has the power to. Father is not as strong as he once was. And I think maybe maybe these mistakes are an indication that it doesn't really matter if you're talented at something if you don't have the focus and care, right? Like Ada might be coming into this power as her father's power wanes, but without a care, without the attention for it, it really does nothing. Furthermore, building on this, that the father has maybe lost his power, is when Lorraine arrives acting weird, the father notices that she's weird. Like she's just sort of spewing sentences that don't make sense in any context, but he doesn't diagnose her. And early on, he does diagnose the patient whose mental illness has manifested into a physical illness, but he doesn't do it with Lorraine. And then when Lorraine needs fixing, the father's like, no, I can't fix this. There's too much here I haven't seen. Like I don't know. I don't know how to fix this. And spoilers, this was what I was not expecting. This is the big spoiler here. Ada kills her father. And she has this sort of realization all at once that it was a new kind of knowing. I could hurt him, that my body was capable of damaging his on 172. And like all of a sudden she realizes that just like the cures, she can reach into him and pull him apart and deconstruct him, unalive him. He starts, I guess, sort of turning into mulch or soil, like where her hand goes in. He starts to unalive in a very like natural, woodsy, return to the earth sort of way. They were born of the earth, and he is literally turning back to earth. And that the father couldn't stop this. I think maybe his death was premature, for sure, but I think it's definitely hinted at that he is sort of past his prime, that Ada is cued to step into this new role, this role as, I guess, like healer, leader of this like practice, for lack of a better word. She's going to be the head of this medical practice and take over their patients, take over the family business, make that income. They get paid. It's unclear in what, but they do get paid. And she refuses. So I think building on this idea of the ground, we have the idea of burying, and we see literal burying happen in the text, but then there are also metaphorical things that are buried. So, I mean, there's the burying, I guess, of the secret of who is Olivia's baby. That's sort of a more, I guess, literal burying, like it's buried between the lines in this text. You have to sort of get the wink wink, like have the mind in the gutter to be like, oh yeah, the siblings were fucking. And then there's the repressed things. So I feel like it's hard not to bring up Sigmund Freud. He has problematic theories, but so much of his psychoanalysis is rooted in literature and myth. And then maybe because it's so wacky, also leads to a lot of literature playing with these theories. And I think we can do some Freudian readings of this text, especially with the idea of burial with repression. So the idea that you take something that's really upsetting and you push it away, unconsciously push it away, so you don't have to deal with those feelings right away. I was also, like Lydia has mentioned in the chat, that it was shocking when she killed her father. 100%. Like, that was one of those twists where I was like, oh, these immortal beings, like, they live forever. Like, it never occurred to me that these beings that heal so well could unheal, could unalive people. And that was a interesting, I guess, manifestation of the feelings, I guess, that Ada has repressed. Like, Ada has a lot of anger towards her father. Her father has built her this purposeless life that she's really not happy with. And there are many times where she's holding back. She's like, I just don't want to deal with these feelings. And she's holding back. And what manifests at the end is her killing her father. Ada's also burying some key facts about Samson. There is like we've mentioned, a very willing suspension of disbelief around what Samson is doing with his sister, what Samson is doing interested in her when she looks like a child. There's maybe, debatably, some repressed feelings on the father's side. So in one of the instances where Ada is having some difficulties with her father, finding her father really frustrating, we learn about Ada's predecessors. So Ada wasn't the first. She comes across in like this thicket of hedge that's very difficult to get into. She comes across these piles of waste, and that's how she describes them. They would have been branches, but their color and shape weren't right. And she's like, what is this? And the father's like, oh, I forgot they were here. And she's deeply disturbed by the fact that the father is so nonchalant about his miscarriages. Because that's essentially what these are. We see 2 near miscarries in this book. And he's just like, he sort of brushes it off. Like, this happened a few times. They take on the color and shape and the density of bones, and then they'd stop growing. And there was nothing I could do to get them going again. And he just like immediately moves on, and he's like, can you see the roots? Let's get back to these crisscross roots. I don't want to talk about this. And I wonder if there's maybe a repression of like his failures. Like, if in, like, we've heard that the ground is really powerful here. So it's something that he's doing in his recipe for building a child that fails every time. And that there are a lot of piles of waste here. It seems to be an overwhelming amount for Ada to encounter. And he's just, that has to hurt, right? Like, that has to have this disappointment happen over and over again for the father. I feel like, again, it's repression of things. And Ada is like frustrated with him that it took so long to get it right, that he left them there not caring that Ada might see them, that you toss these half-formed things away without ceremony. And father says, it sounds like a cure's gotten under your skin. That she's had too human a reaction to this. So part of me wonders if Ada is unique in the fact that she has these really human emotions, or if the father, who has had so many human emotions, has to distance himself, has to bury these things, has to bury these feelings, because they do live a very boring, quiet life. Like, if he's focused on his failures, like that would be hard to distract from, hard to live with, right? I don't know. I feel like Lydia's mentioned in the chat that if they had a better father-daughter relationship, so many things would not have gone wrong. And I totally agree that, like, as these creatures that are quite unique in the fact that they have unnaturally long lifespans, they have the unique experience of magic. It sounds like they can maybe both shapeshift, but Ada isn't interested in it because the father's like, oh, you want to come out hunting with me? And she's like, no, that's not my thing. I have other things. Like, you would think that their shared experience of constantly being outsiders, watching the human world sort of bypass them all the time, would bring them closer together, but it doesn't. And part of me wonders if maybe Ada isn't old enough emotionally to do that. So this, I think, gets into the question of consent and whether or not Ada can consent to her sexual relationship with Samson. So I think regardless of the fact that Ada looks not quite adult, like, a lot of cures identify her as being weirdly childlike for a very long time, she has been alive for decades longer than Samson. She has more life experience than Samson has in his, like, 20-something years. But teenage brains aren't fully developed. They don't finish developing until they're, like, mid-20s. And that's why teenagers have, like, I don't want to say issues, difficulties with, like, planning, prioritizing, impulse control. Like, that's one of the last pieces of our brains to mature, right? And so I found a science article, because this is not my area of expertise, but so it was an article on teen brain behavior, problem solving, and decision making. And based on the stage of teen development, adolescents are more likely to act on impulse, misread or misinterpret social cues and emotions, get into accidents of all kind, get involved in fights, engage in dangerous or risky behavior, and they are less likely to think before they act, pause to consider the consequences of their actions, and change their dangerous or inappropriate behaviors. And when I read this list, I was like, oh, this is Ada in a nutshell. Like, she behaves like a teenager. She doesn't behave like an adult. If we think about, like, what she's doing all day, she is wandering the back lanes, fucking an adult man. She's wandering alone too. Like, it's also established that, like, father was kind of wary of her around the other cures because, like, she was unsettling, and, like, he tried to protect her as a kid because the other kids were, like, weird with her. So, like, she's out wandering by herself. And then we think about engaging in, like, poorly thought out impulsive actions. For example, pushing your lover into the ground to change him into something more palatable, to fix the bad boy, and or murdering your father because he doesn't want you to date the bad boy. Those sound like very teenaged decisions. And she says she has a plan. She says tricking Samson and lying to her father was the plan. But this is such a poorly thought out plan. Like, it's so bad. Like, I don't know about any relationship that could survive a betrayal like that. Like, she has told Samson, like, yes, I'll run away with you. Like, this is the plan. I'm going to get you away from your weird, incestuous relationship with your childhood abuser, and we're going to start a life together, and it'll be grand. Like, you don't care that I'm weird. I don't care that you're a little bit sick. Let's go start a life. And she pushes him into the scary living dirt and imprisons him for years in the hopes of changing him to be something more palatable, more compatible. It's just not good. It's not good. And even if Samson comes back and he is changed to like live as long as her or to age as slowly as her, how could they ever have any sort of relationship again? Like, it does seem like Samson genuinely trusted her, was genuinely interested in a possibly inappropriate relationship with her. But nonetheless, a genuine relationship, and she fucks that up with her impulsive decision. So I guess my iffiness here is the question of whether or not Samson is a pedophile. Do we believe that because he is interested in Ada and she appears underaged, that he is sick? The father thinks he's sick. Ada doesn't think he's sick. Ada might physically look like a child, but has the sexual interests of an adult woman, and wants those longings, as she describes them, fulfilled. She is very much consenting? Question mark? Can she consent, though, if she has teenage brain? I would say no, but she's also not a human. So I'm having this, like, back and forth where, like, father says that, like, no, this man is sick by continuing to sleep with him, and, like, even though you are many years older than a human child, you look like a human child, you're allowing that sickness to grow in him. You're allowing him to feed that inappropriate desire. And Ada's like, I don't care. Like, I am in charge of my body. I'm in charge of my longings. I don't care if this makes him sicker. I don't care if one day he gets bored of me and he goes and he finds a cure girl. I'm getting what I want out of him. And the father says, I think some of this sickness has gotten into you, because we know that sickness has to go somewhere, right? This is again making me think that on the one hand, she's like, my body, my choice. I'm an adult human acting on my sexual desire. On the other hand, the logic of that, where she's like, I don't care if he's a pedophile, Dad. Like, even saying that sentence, this video is like not getting monetized. YouTube's gonna hate this. But within the context of the book, right? Like, that response is such a childish response. That, like, I don't care what you think about my boyfriend. Like, I like my boyfriend. And, like, how many young people, like, even myself, recently, a youth leader that was much older than myself, who we all knew as kids. It was rumored, nobody saw it with their eyes, but we'd all heard about it, that this youth leader, who was an adult, was engaging in sexual things with the teens in his youth group. And when we were kids, we thought it was weird, but we didn't really see a problem with it because it was cool that an older guy was interested in these girls. And so the fact that Ada is in this relationship where she's like, this is the one guy that likes me. He's perfect. He does exactly what I want. I feel good when I'm with him. I don't care what you think. I don't care that you think that he's a creepy old perv. Feels so true. Like, it rings so true. So I don't know. I have a difficult time viewing her as like a consenting adult when so much of her actions throughout the book read as a teenage response to something. I don't know how folks feel about that. Like, if they also felt like complexly towards the relationship, or if you were just like, now Samson's a creepy perv. He needs to go. I also think, furthering this, like, Ada's young person brain, she pushes Samson into the ground against his will. And her logic is, I can't leave and you can't stay. The ground will keep you safe. I'm going to imprison you for a little bit. We'll see what happens. She magically cures people. Samson has expressed multiple times that he believes he's sick. I feel like an adult response would be, my father doesn't like that you are unwell. I do magical healing. Can I attempt to magically heal you? That would be the, like, adult response. Like, I have this thing that I can offer you. It will fix both of our problems. Father won't think you're a pervert anymore, and you'll get to stay with me, right? To just decide for him and push him in the ground feels like a very poorly thought out, impulsive, childish move. Like, this seems like the most logical thing, and I'm just going to do it. Like, no concept of how other people might feel. And I feel like that's something that kids are very known for, right? Like, it's something that I come up with when I come up against in middle grade a lot, that children are terrible people because they haven't learned to be better yet. Like, they're learning these lessons. And a lot of the times we're seeing that in middle grade, we're seeing that in young adults. Kids are terrible people because they don't have, again, the cognitive ability to think out the consequences of these actions a lot of the time. And so I'm inclined to read this relationship as really gross. And I feel like, nope, I lost my train of thought. I'm not going to go there. Lydia has mentioned in the chat that Ada also definitely spoke her feelings about humans as well, her superiority, her superiority and belief that she could do what she wanted with him. Yes, I agree. She does seem to have this odd, and again, it's a very, like, young person mentality that, like, I know best. I can do this. Yeah, she's interesting. I think the Olivia Sampson thing is maybe the thing that, like, I don't know. Now, the more I talk about Ada, I was like, I really think the Olivia Sampson thing is the interesting thing in this book. But now that I'm thinking about Ada, her messiness is also really interesting. When we think about her sexual desire, we have this paragraph on 23 where she says, quote, "There wasn't a way I didn't want to swallow him whole, not only up between my legs, but down my throat. I'd opened up many cures, but couldn't think what he had inside him that would let him build this fire in me, this tingling that built and built until I thought it'd tear me apart. Couldn't think how I'd changed so much in so short a time that I wanted it so badly to be torn," end quote. Like, if this is not just the, like, most hormonal teenaged, like, outpouring of desire. And I feel like this is the thing about Ada. This isn't a love story. She never says that she loves Samson, that she enjoys his company, that she thinks they're really well suited together. She wants to consume him. She hungers for him. And she burns her life down to have sex with him for the rest of her life. It's not love, it's lust. And in many ways, I feel like that's quite radical. Like, so many stories are love stories where women change their lives radically for love, from, like, romance to, like, a fantasy narrative. Like, if we think of Éowyn from Lord of the Rings, who is this subversive figure. She's, like, on the battlefield fighting for her country, and then she falls in love, she becomes a wife and a mother, and she vows never to pick up her sword again. She has love that totally overrules her, or not overrules, overtakes, I think is a better word. It overtakes her previous interests. And she can't behave selfishly anymore, right? She has a husband and children to look after. Whereas Ada is fully selfishly in this for sex. And as terrible, maybe, as that is, like, she kind of imprisons a human and forces him to become slow aging, quasi immortal, so that she can have sex with him forever. And she murders her father to do that. Like, it's terrible, and it's radical, and it's bold. I don't like it. It does not make Ada a likable character at all, but it is bold. And I mean, Father does ask her, "What is it you like about him, Ada?" on page 67. And she's like, "Only the feeling he makes inside me." And I feel like this is, again, one of those vague lines that could be read two ways. Only the feeling he makes inside my heart. Or she talks a lot about, like, how when they have penetrative sex, he hits this bruised spot inside her, and it's really good. And so she could be saying to her father, "I literally like the feeling of penetrative sex. I like the feeling of him inside me." And Father's going, "But what do you like about him?" Like, we could read that as something human and emotional, or we could read that as something very, like, callous and physical. And there is the openness in that line, and it is unclear to me what the author's intention was. My reading is personally that this is a very, like, cold, non-human magical creature response. Because she isn't human. She doesn't express love at all, even to her father, really. So I'm inclined to read this quite literally. What she likes about him is the feeling he makes inside her, which is kind of bleak, I guess. And the reason that she wants Samson, she explains to her father, is that it wasn't enough. The life that he has offered her wasn't enough. The life of being a woman who just spends her whole extended life curing other people wasn't enough. It wasn't fulfilling. She needs him for sex because then at least she has something in her life that she likes. And again, very teenage reaction. When the father's like, why did you put Samson in the ground when I explicitly said that this was a bad and dangerous thing? Like, we don't attempt to cure mental illness. And she's like, well, I'm not all to blame. You must have known that I'd get lonely. So she's blaming her father for making her in such a way that she would get lonely, that she would want a sexual companion, which I find interesting. Does that mean the father doesn't have that? And it goes back to the idea that father sometimes looks at Ada and is like, I don't know if you turned out quite right. I don't know. There's a lot, and it goes back to the messiness of their relationship. And I want to touch on the idea of loneliness, because Ada talks about how she's lonely. And I almost feel like it's a self-inflicted loneliness. So she keeps saying that she had to fix Samson, she had to put him to ground and keep him because he's the only human that has ever been broken enough to be interested in her, and she needs him. She needs him to make her life worth living. But I feel like this isn't true. We see two queer women in the text who seem to express a genuine interest in spending time with Ada, and she just rejects them. She doesn't want anything to do with female friendship. All she wants is sex with a man, which is kind of a weird thing to get out of this book, too. So there's Lila Gideo. So when she comes back to life, she doesn't breathe right away, and Ada does mouth to mouth. And Lila sort of seems to be like clinging around and wanting to ask questions and say thank you and being like, oh, the feeling of your lips on mine, like, that was really intimate. And Ada says to her, like, directly says to her, quote, you ever feel unwell, you come here. Don't come here besides, end quote. And makes Lila cry. And then her father is like, why did she leave crying? And Ada's just like, I don't know, cures being cures, they're emotional. But like, she was just like, fuck off, I don't want to be friends with you. The second person is Lorraine, and we can see that Lorraine really wants to make connections with Ada. So Lorraine initially came for a curing and then keeps coming back. Even though she's been cured, she just keeps coming back for these treatments because they make her feel so good. And she hangs around and she brings postcards of her travels around the world, and she shares these stories of her travels. Or else she just hang around the house and she'd busy herself around Ada and father's house. And Ada says she never wanted to go, and she's annoyed by this. She has to make up excuses to get this person out of her hair. And we've been told that this is not a typical reaction. Like, Ada has told us that the cured children fear her. The first boy she tried to have sex with bit her and ran away. that people are often made uncomfortable by her. But here we have another person who is lonely and just wants to hang out with her. Lorraine could provide this companionship piece seemingly as willingly as Samson, just without the whole pedophile aspect. So it doesn't seem like Ada wants companionship. This is building on my point that Ada blows up her life for sex. Because she has 2 offers of female friendship, and like Lorraine is taking a genuine interest. Like she's like, hey, so I know that you and your father, you don't seem to talk a lot. Or she asks Ada to tell her about her day, something that her father doesn't seem to do, right? Like she's trying to make this genuine connection, and Ada doesn't want it. So it's not that Cures won't take an interest in Ada. Some of them do. Like, we can't be friends with everybody. That's just a fact of life. And here we have 2 people who want to be friends, and she says no. We have the ending. I mean, I think... Oh, you know what? Before we go to the ending, I just remembered. I just saw Lydia's comment again about how Ada is superior to humans. Like, she feels superior to humans. I wonder if that plays into why she doesn't want female friendship. That if she's not getting anything out of this interaction, seemingly anything out of this interaction with humans, if it's not worth pursuing. If that, because she's like magical and long living, and like these humans' lives are so short and fleeting in the grand space of her life, what is the point of making temporary friends if they're not giving you sex? I wonder if that idea about her judgment and her feelings of humans being somewhat lowly plays into the rejection of these friendships. Okay. Ada murders her father. The end twist that I did not see coming. Was that naive of me? Did anyone see that coming? Like, first of all, that she could kill her father. And then the way that he dies, it was brutal. Lydia mentions here that he sat decomposing. She doesn't even put him in the ground. She takes him up to the attic where he emits this dying chord for years as he slowly decomposes into soil. And like, she regularly at the beginning crawls up into the attic where he nursed her as a baby to hang out with his corpse. And I feel like that, again, we have to bring up Freud and his bullshit. So we have parricide, which is murder of the father. We see that played out in myth with the king of Thebes being murdered by Oedipus. The whole Oedipus complex comes from that, which is, according to Freud, the idea that boys want to kill their fathers and have sex with their mothers and that nonsense. But the idea of murdering a parental figure in order to have an inappropriate sexual relationship is something that we have here. We don't have the classic Oedipal complex, but we do have that loose playing with this idea. Again, it comes back to myth and folklore that Ada engages in this, and part of me feels really naive for not seeing it, for the ways that Freud is sort of at work in this text throughout in so many ways. Like, I feel like there are like 100 thesis. Like, you could write your dissertation on this. 100 people could write a dissertation on this and probably come up with 100 different angles. Like, there's so much happening in this text. So I feel like I was surprised by the murder of the father, but then I feel like I shouldn't have been because it's all there. Okay, I'm going to move on again. Rapidly changing topics here at the end. Last live show for the book club, we read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. And I, at the time, was like, oh, this is like feminist critical thinking. Maybe I'll try and tie in A Room of One's Own to Follow Me to Ground. I have no idea if that's possible, but I'm going to try. And so I have a proposal. I would love your input. I feel like this connection is not a stretch. It's another one of those, like, if you wanted to write your dissertation and argue this, you could prove it, I feel like. So Woolf's thesis, really, in A Room of One's Own is that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Now, Ada isn't writing fiction. To our knowledge, she has no interest other than fucking, but maybe this is part of her problem. Well, stay with me. Ada doesn't make money. She does the cures, and the cures pay her father, possibly not in money, possibly in like trading. It's unclear. We don't hear about them ever going into town to buy objects, but father has coffee, which I assume isn't native to the land where they are sort of floating unsettled in the world. And like they have objects in their house like linens and towels. They have clothing that people don't comment on as being weird. So presumably they're purchasing clothing or at least cloth to make clothing. So there's somehow money is coming into the household, but none of it is Ada's. None of it is at her disposal. We don't see her buying anything for herself. Everything that she does is utilitarian, right? Like when we talked about the ways that women have found to be fulfilled as artists, like through the work that they were allowed to do, making useful work beautiful. So you're looking at beautiful knitwear, beautiful embroidery, beautiful sewing, like quilts that tell stories, that kind of work. That was utilitarian and beautiful. We don't see Ada doing that. We are told that father tears up like strips of linen to like staunch blood flow, and Ada's like, I'll have to wash those, then I'll probably have to sew them back into a sheet later. Like everything that she does is a chore. And the brief times that we see Ada pursuing something for herself, her father interrupts her. So the moment that really stands out is Ada's like investigating nature. And she's taken an interest in some nature, and the father calls her and is like, oh, we have a cure. I'm going to interrupt you in your work. You got to come inside and do some work. And it's this interruption of a pursuit of her own interest. She doesn't have the money or space to be on her own. And we see her getting interrupted when she is pursuing her own interests. And I think that's where I'm starting to see Woolf's idea. It isn't until Samson comes along that Ada even recognizes what she does as work. So he asks Ada what she does for fun, and she sort of coyly is like, never you mind. But what she was really thinking is nothing aside from having sex with you. This is all I do with my life. I have nothing. And Samson's like, well, like, what are you doing? And she's like, it's not work. Like, it's what I was made for. And Samson goes, well, it looks a lot like labor, and it's poorly paid. And I feel like this, again, going back to Woolf, this is how women's labor has been treated historically, that taking care of the home, it's not paid work. It's the purpose that women were made for. Bearing and raising children, it's not work. It's the purpose that women exist for, historically speaking. And now I'm starting to wonder about the father making Ada. Did he deliberately make a woman? Because his father, like the father's father, made a son. He chose to make a daughter. So, sorry, I'm going to turn the ringer off. Let's not do that again. Right? Like was the choice to build Ada a deliberately gendered one? That he wanted somebody who was more suited to the work, perhaps, than he was. Like, they keep talking about how father is a little bit more animal. He's isolated. He really itches to get out of his clothes and into his animal form and in the woods. And so maybe he thinks that he needs to make a daughter to do this work, to continue this line of work, that men aren't suited to this work. And then I also loved the idea in Woolf's work where Woolf talks about how our squashed, our repressed novelists and poets are the witches of history. And like that really rings true here. So Woolf says, when, however, one reads of a witch, of a wise woman selling herbs, then I think we are on track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet. And she also talks about how any woman born with a great gift in the 16th century would certainly have gone crazed, shot herself, or ended her days in some lonely cottage outside the village, half witch, half wizard, feared and mocked at. And I feel like, does that not describe Ada, right? That she's this witchy healing woman on the edge of the village. She's been so forced to fulfill the role that she was built for, to the point that it's not even work, it's just her purpose. Performing domestic labor, curing people, tending to the sick, cleaning linens, sewing linens, keeping the house clean post curings, right? All that women's work, that is the purpose that she was built for. She has no other purpose. She's not been allowed another purpose. So of course, in Woolf's logic, she's going to go crazy. She's going to become a little bit sick herself. The father keeps saying that Samson's sickness has leached into Ada. Is it that Samson's sickness has leached into Ada, or has Ada been set up to fail? That Ada lacks a purpose, that Ada needs something for herself, and she has gone a little bit crazy. Hence, pushing her boyfriend into the ground to change him and murdering her father, right? So that is that was my little homework to try and connect the two. I think it's fair. I think you could make that reading. Which brings me on to the fact that, do you think the father is too controlling? I feel like at points he reads like the overprotective father of a teenage daughter. Like he's like, I can smell that you've been going around with a boy. Who's taking up all your time? I don't like that boy, right? Like he reads like the father that is like, well, you're my child. I obviously have a say over what you're doing with your time. But then he also created her to be his predecessor, his partner in the curing practice. like his purpose in life is to cure and to pass on this ability to somebody of a similar mind. So I guess in some ways he wants her to fulfill this purpose and to carry on this thing. But again, she's her own person, right? Like he created her to be a thinking creature. Lydia has mentioned in the chat, the father seemed too controlling. It's true that because he's so in control of her schedule, it is interesting that she finds the time to go for these long walks to meet up with Samson, that she manages to find that leisure time. But then he also says that one of them says, or thinks it, that Samson is making her lazy. So maybe the father is doing more curing than I think. We just don't see it because Ada doesn't see it because she's not there, right? It's one of those like, if your protagonist doesn't see it, it doesn't happen. So maybe the father's working all the time by himself, and that's why he's started like, oh, Ada, you're here. You're going to do this by yourself, right? Like, I've done the last 5, but we don't get to see that. The one thing, again, he does seem very controlling, but he also sees that Samson is an adult who is interested in someone who looks like a child. And he knows that it is a taboo for adult humans to sleep with child humans. So the father knows that Samson's interest in his daughter is messed up. And I mean, the father has obviously lived longer. He has more decades of being exposed to humans, of, I guess, the reason I say that is because Ada is like, well, you forget that I'm not a cure. Like, I don't care that Samson is a pedophile. I don't care that he and his sister are having sex with each other. Like, I am not human. That, like, taboo doesn't apply to me. It's not my society. It's not my social taboo. So part of me wonders if the father has just been around long enough to pick up more of those human taboos. I don't know. And again, I feel like it comes back to that controlling factor, comes back to whether or not we think that Ada is mature enough as a non-human magical creature to consent. And I don't know that the father is necessarily wrong to discourage Ada from pursuing that relationship. But I also don't know if he does it in the right way. And that's sort of just something that I've been thinking about ever since I've read the book. Like, could the father have done something different? I don't know. And then we have the ending, the very last little bit. Samson's son shows up, and Ada finally gets that Samson was sleeping with his sister and got her pregnant. And again, in that reveal moment, I don't know if that was supposed to be a twist. I feel like it was so there between the lines throughout the book. She seems surprised when she gets it. She doesn't care, but she's surprised. And she's perfectly happy to continue her sexual relationship with Samson once he comes out of the ground. And there's this bit at the end where she, I didn't write it all out because it's long, but she's like, No matter if he's strange, no matter if he's been birthed with a flicker he hadn't before, no matter if he's cruel or governed by a hungry fever, no matter because I'll no longer be sat here with my heart unseated and my insides crackling dry. So long, too long, in the desert. And that the history of folklore, because again, this text is steeped in folklore, folk, fairy stories, all of that, about things that rise from the ground, indicate that Samson is going to be changed probably for the worse, right? Vampires, zombies, they aren't typically in folk and fairy stories cool, nice people that you want to be your lover. I also can't help but think of Practical Magic, which I think came out in the 90s, and Jimmy Angelo. And he was an abusive serial killer in real life. And when the sisters kill him and then bring him back to life, he comes back even more strange and unnatural. That death doesn't improve sickness in people. It doesn't improve any perversions that they may have. And I don't, I'm kind of at a loss for words because that's how I feel about the ending of this book. Like, it's so like, she's so excited because Samson has risen from the grave, and part of her brain is like, gee, he could be kind of dangerous. I don't know if his human son should go near him. But also, I'm really excited to resume our sexual relationship after 20 years of him being buried in the ground, stewing on all of his anger, all of his sickness, right? And it's an open ending. It's certainly an open ending, and I want to talk about, because it sort of loops, right? In rereading it, I realized that the very first part of this book, the one with the slug on the cover, it starts with the ground rumbling. And so I wanted to quickly talk about the animals on each of the covers. I swear, this is almost my my last thought. I had a lot of thoughts about this book. So I wanted to talk quickly about the animals and how the animal maybe invites us to frame each segment of the book. So we have this slug at the beginning, and the house is overrun by slugs. She's grossed out by them. She can like hear them in the drain, and she's like, oh, I could pour salt on them, but like I don't really care that much. And the ground is churning, and it's a weird little snapshot. When you first start the book, it's a weird way to start, right? Just slugs. There's so many slugs, and she's not dealing with them. And so you get this sense that, at least I get this sense, that something has gone very wrong. Like if you have an army of slugs living in your drain, something has gone quite wrong. And again, it made me think of Practical Magic, where wherever Jimmy Angelo goes, he has those frogs. He just sort of leaks frogs. And again, we sort of have that slimy creature leaking. So I wonder if the presence of so many slugs is an indication of what Samson has done to the ground around the house, that the father says a man like that will poison the ground. Like, we have to get him out of the ground because he's going to do damage to the ground around this house. And then they have this overrunning of slugs. The part two, the image that we get is a wolf. And that's like your little folklore ping, right? So you have the idea of a wolf in sheep's clothing, the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood as a predator, and also werewolves, right? You have the father as a shapeshifter. I thought at one point he was described as a bear, but then at another point, the way his limbs are described, I thought he was maybe more wolf-like. I feel like Samson is definitely a wolf. The whole idea of the wolf in sheep's clothing, or the predator, right? Like the wolf dresses up as granny to trick a young person, a young woman, into their presence, into their bed, especially because Little Red Riding Hood is often read as a warning for young girls, like the idea to not stray from the path, because there are the dangers of men lurking in the woods, right? Like that's sort of the warning wrapped up in like a cute wolf and like a girl picking flowers in the woods. That there's a ugliness to fairy tales. I think we get that here with Samson. Samson is probably our wolf. We also learn that one of the cures, Melinda Saccharin, fears Ada because she once saw Ada in the woods lying with a wolf, and the wolf was licking her. And if the father does shapeshift into a wolf, then the father and her were just like laying in the grass, having this weird, physically affectionate relationship that appears really unnatural to the cures. So like a lot of stuff with the wolf in part 2, right? And that folklore element that we can sort of bring in to guide us, I guess. And then part 3, we have the magpie. So magpies are intelligent birds, and Ada feels really watched by them. She feels birds' like eyes on her when she is neglecting her work or trying to hide a mistake. She feels the birds are watching her. We also have in this section the idea of women with clipped wings. So that also Samson's in the ground at this point. Has Ada in some way clipped Samson's wings, right? Like she's taken this bird, and all throughout, Ada has a weird relationship with birds. There's a line about how the birds learned to fear her somewhere. Of course, I didn't write that down, but that at some point the birds learned to fear her. So if we're thinking about clipped wings, kept women, like women kept in the home in certain roles, and also she's captured Samson, she's clipped his wings. And then the last one, we get biblical. We got a rattlesnake, we got the snake. So snake, biblically, temptation, right? We have the Garden of Eden, we have Eve listening to the snake, eating the apple, causing the fall of humanity. So there are 2 people I think we can view as the snake in this section. We have Olivia as the snake. She does nothing for years. So she is pregnant with her brother's baby, and her brother just disappears. And her dying wish is for her son to go and blow up Ada and Samson's life, because she believes that they have been secretly together, building this happy life together. And her like last sneaky move to get back at both of them is to send the incest baby that's like the spitting image of Samson to drop this bomb that Samson was fucking his sister. So there's one snake. And then I think we could also read Ada as the snake. So she betrayed both Samson and her father in tricking them, in abusing their trust, I guess. And then she did this to feed her lust. It was a selfish action. Ada acts selfishly, and who knows what creature she has created in putting Samson to ground. Like what has she unleashed on humanity in the same way that Eve sort of causes the fall? What has Ada caused by giving into temptation? So I liked I liked the images, and in coming back to them, I think they're interesting for framing each section. Okay, final thing, because I didn't know where else to put this. I think you could do a colonial or an environmental reading of this text. So the idea that father has tamed a patch of land, and that the burial patch is tamed, the ground, the long lawn, it gorged on bodies, shaped them to its own liking. So there's something different about the wild ground, the untamed ground, and that the ground is like slowly reclaiming the burial patch, like roots are coming back in. And Ada is warned continuously to stay off the ground, to stay away from the ground, because it will try and take them back if it can. And I couldn't help thinking of Uprooted by Naomi Novik, which, like, the woods in that are alive and evil and poisonous and like attempting to reclaim the land. So around the edges of the human civilizations, the ground is fighting back, the land is fighting back, and resisting being civilized, resisting this like colonization, this abuse of the land. And so I think it's interesting to note that Ada is unwilling to participate in the colonization of the land. Like in this reading, if we think about it as like a colonial environmental practice, Ada says, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. And she lets the ground go after her father is murdered, after her father dies. She tells us that she does nothing with her time. She spends her days like lazing around, singing to Samson through the grass. And she every once in a while, whispers a spell, I think, to protect the sorrel leaves from creatures that will eat them. But everything else she has let go, which I assume over like the 2 decades and like the following many decades of her life, she's going to let the ground reclaim the burial patch. She has refused to participate in the father's practice of colonizing the land, of working the land. So, which again makes it interesting that Ada is a woman. So we know that the grandfather came from the ground, that he cultivated the land, he colonized the land, that he passed that practice on to his son, the father, Ada's father, and Ada goes, no, I'm breaking this cycle. I am not continuing to use the land. It's just going to be, right? So again, going back to the quote at the very beginning from the one journalist, that follow me to ground is odd and muscular enough to resist easy interpretation. I feel like this is just such a fun text. Like this is such a cool text. It's weird. It's like utterly bizarre, like very fucked up in places. Like I was not expecting to get something so horrific out of this, but like I utterly enjoyed every moment of this text. I have enjoyed putting this all together, and I could see myself at some point rereading this along with Uprooted and thinking more about texts where the land is active and like the ground isn't really personified in this, but the ground is an entity. The ground is alive in ways that it typically isn't for most people. So like, yeah, they describe the ground as like chewing and belching. Like maybe it is personified a little bit, that like, I don't know. There's a lot here, and I loved this. So I hope that folks, I don't know if you can hear the loud truck, but I hope that folks enjoyed this. I had so much fun reading this. The next book that we will be reading in July, there is a patron exclusive Stephen King book club. And so we're covering Roadwork, which is a Bachman book. So if you're a patron, that will be on Saturday, July 23rd at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And patrons heard about this earlier today, but we had some books submitted and the voting patrons voted. And the next book that we were reading is sort of on theme. We're going from Follow Me to Ground to Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh. So this is our August read. This is a YouTube Live book, so that everybody is welcome for this. I've read this before, and if I could describe it in 3 words, I feel like our keywords for this are woods, fae, and gayness. And that is what I will leave you with for now for this book. It is another weird little read, steeped in folklore, rooted in the woods. And I would like to try another weeknight for this. So the live stream for Silver in the Wood will be Wednesday, August 31st at 7:30 p.m. EST. I will be posting about this closer to. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm going to set myself the challenge again. I've tried to connect A Room of One's Own to Follow Me to Ground. So next time I will try and connect Follow Me to Ground to Silver in the Wood. I'm hoping that, there's a more obvious connection just because of how they are. But yeah, we'll see. Maybe they won't connect at all. So yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for spending your time with me, for chatting, Lydia. If you're watching this on the replay, let me know your thoughts. There's a lot here, and it's just such a fun text. I hope that you folks have enjoyed listening to this and have enjoyed reading this if you did read it. So yeah, I will let you all go. I'm gonna head out for the evening, and we'll see you soon with another video. Bye.